See, you want to keep this place just like it is, actually. Like one big national forest. To look at, to study. Great, you're a spesh. See, where we differ is that with you, Earth doesn't come first, actually. With me, it does. When I say Earth, Keys, I mean people, men. You worry about deer and trees and fiberweed. Fine, that's your thing. But I like to see things in perspective, from the top down. And the top, so far, is humans. In my analysis, I found that the true keystone of Bloodborne's thesis is sass. Many characters will do a classic Dark Souls laugh at the player, but like in the rest of the series, local yahoos are never coded as reliable narrators. They are diegetically crazy people.
How you poor, poor thing.
Bloodborne, on the other hand, delegates its casting of shade to the most authoritative voice in the game, that being the UI itself. German, upon our first meeting with him in the Hunter's Dream, tells us to insert clip. No, wait, that's the...
Don't think too hard about all of this.
Eileen the Crow tells us to stop shivering in our boots through a crack in the fourth wall.
Still lingering about. What's wrong? A hunter unnerved by a few beasts. Enough trembling in your boots. A hunter must hunt.
Even the first basic fodder enemies stand a head or two above the player, while farther up, the Gothic edifices of Yharnam loom over us like cackling shadows. Yet when we beat our first boss, the UI says, "Prey slaughtered," as if the game has not insisted at every level unto this point that the player themselves are the prey. A scampering rat, a pathetic little fucker, but a hunter nonetheless. What could be more masculine than beast hunting? Stomping through the streets, blunderbuss in one hand, saw cleaver in the other, prowling through the infamously gendered Victorian cityscape. Urbanist Elizabeth Wilson suggested that the association of the city with the masculine was set in cobbled stone as early as the Renaissance. Contemporary urban thinkers and designers thought of the city as a unified visual whole that should reflect rational, geometric principles assigned to the male sphere long before their time, first appearing in recorded history as early as antiquity. Meanwhile, the countryside was associated with qualities of human life pertaining to the body and the organic, those of the feminine sphere. The city was then, like the act of hunting, a symbol of masculine dominance over the feminine sphere, not just metaphorically, but practically. During the Renaissance, the process of distinguishing the city from the country was still ongoing. As we'll see in Pentiment later, the inert countryside was falling behind the city, no longer the dominant masculine realm of progress, but a docile feminine environment. With the seat of economical power moving, the remaining medieval architecture fell into disrepair and out of favor. As the rural landscape fell into the shadow of the city, its rolling hills and fertility came to be seen as a reflection of women's bodies, a secondary, less powerful locale to the city. Cities, so deeply masculinized, were made hostile to women through regulating their space and enforcing those regulations through violence. As urban centers grew, so did the scale of complexity of them as mazes of gender. The rational principles of urban planning, absent in the unplanned, organic expansion of medieval towns and cities, allowed for and necessitated methods of gendered zoning, distinctions of masculine and feminine space. The most basic distinction, of course, was between the feminine private sphere and masculine public sphere, a distinction posited as a founding pillar of society now starting to take on solid shape. Not fully, mind you, that would come in the industrial era with its development in urban planning that separated the workplace from the residence, yet the underlying philosophy is there. The Victorian home was a sanctuary away from the rowdy, smelly boy streets, a seat of moral, aesthetic, and cultural stability that complemented the masculine realm while not superseding it. Victorian is usually one of the first words you'll hear from someone describing Bloodborne to the uninitiated, largely because the visual idea of it is so recognizable, but less obviously because it's so deeply connected to the game's themes of femininity. It's the earliest surviving mode of gender presentation to carry through into current trends. There's never been a resurgence of Roman fashion or medieval peasant home decor, but Victorian aesthetic influence is a central aspect of contemporary ideas of feminine beauty and proper behavior. It was during that era when the concept of taste and all its intricate social vocabulary finally trickled down to the burgeoning middle class. Therefore, the pragmatism and ungendered symbolism of hunter trip, as one would have it, is a nice aesthetic complement to the gameplay's implications. While Yharnam itself runs the gamut of architectural intricacy from the Forbidden Woods to Cathedral Ward and everything beneath it, the big cheese is of course Gothic architecture. The Gothic churches we see in Bloodborne are relics to Yharnam the same way they were to actual Victorian cities. Antiquated, yes, but too important both practically and historically to simply demolish. One of the most telling compromises made because of this is right at the center of Bloodborne's story as perhaps the most poignant visual metaphor for the conflict between old and new. But that conflict needs some story context, so it'll have to wait while we explore why that conflict is so important in the first place. Dare I say yonic characteristics of Gothic buildings came to be seen as feminine mainly because of their contrast to the stately, masculine locales that contrasted them. But beyond the facade is their conflict with the new, the primitive feminine and the sophisticated progressive masculine. The subordination of the countryside to the city was economical in nature, but it was contextualized through the passage of time. Antiquated architecture took on an association with the feminine to reinforce the idea of cities as a realm of masculine progress. The association of order, progress, knowledge, and dominance with masculinity emerged in the Renaissance and carried into the gendering of aesthetics that we see from the Victorian era to the modern day. So when we talk about architecture in Bloodborne, it's useful to consider the implications of it as a visual theme and narrative device. So where does it fit into that narrative as a device? Bloodborne depicts a catastrophe of masculinity. As the plot goes on, more and more of the patriarchy's internal contradictions smack face first into the slimy ass of the Great Ones. Okay, so, long ago, there was a precursor civilization to humanity called Dumur, whose inhabitants dedicated their lives to some eldritch beings or other known as the Great Ones. So called because they had achieved the final stage of evolution and were so advanced they could no longer reproduce, yet they retained a motherly yearning to have children, and as such employ surrogates, one of which being a Dumurian queen called Yharnam, who was to no one's surprise the namesake of Yharnam. Just kidding. It's actually a surprise to the people of Yharnam, many of whom had forgotten their roots up until a guy called Lawrence showed up in town with some mysterious blood and started a church/human experiment club called the Healing Church. Many of Yharnam's old places of worship were turned into research halls or universities, initially under the religious guise respecting Yharnam's occult worship of blood, though that facade deteriorated quickly. The methods of the Healing Church were brutal and only got more extreme with time as they grew more desperate to conquer the Great Ones by any means necessary, in the direct inverse to Old Yharnam and Thumur's reverence for these beings. The heads of the church see themselves as advancing society through dominating nature, masculinely.
Councillors of the old church reside in the high stratum of the Cathedral Ward.
The Healing Church's actions include cutting the children of the Great Ones out of their wombs, initially Kos in the fishing hamlet massacre, and later Queen Yharnam. I mean, she wasn't a great one, but come on. It includes poisoning the water supply of Old Yharnam and later massacring its inhabitants, and also performing brutal experiments on people in the back rooms of their churches and research halls. This all makes more sense if you consider the more accurate translation of the Healing Church as the medical church. It's not actually a religious institution, but rather uses the imagery of religion to hide its true intentions of blood experiments. Everybody's really into blood. I don't know if I said that. Also, it's menstrual blood, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The player character travels to Yharnam to get some of this blood, so they get a transfusion and then get an amnesia, and then they wake up in the Hunter's Dream, which they wake up in again whenever they die because of reasons we get to later. That's the basic setup, which will develop as plot elements start to become relevant. The core of Bloodborne's conflict is a metaphor for systemic exploitation of women's bodies. You can tell, because in the game they have this. That's what the game is. That's what happens in it. But it doesn't go too good, does it? Despite the prevalence of its themes, Bloodborne thankfully has no girl power speech, but instead lets the gendered violence in its narrative speak for itself. The healing or medical church's efforts to harness the power of the Great Ones to attain enlightenment fail over and over because of their masculine ideology of dominance. Being these primordial beings with such a long history of surrounding religious tradition, the Great Ones and Yharnam's spiritual aspects are seen as primitive. While all-knowing, the Great Ones are still women, and that's exactly how our gang of antagonists treat them. The new arrivals and patriarchs of Yharnam, Lawrence, Willem, and to a lesser extent Mikolash, all refuse to truly engage with these female creatures as something greater than themselves, instead endeavoring to unravel, trick, or just flat out kill them. In one of the first areas in the game, the lower cathedral ward, at the altar we unlock after defeating Amelia, we find Lawrence's skull. Touching it gives us a flashback to the moment Lawrence and Willem's conflicting methodologies started the schism between the University of Bergenworth and the Healing Church.
Master Willem, I've come to bid you farewell.
Oh, I know. You think now to betray me.
No, but you will never listen. I tell you, I will not forget our adage.
We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Our eyes are yet to open.
Fear the old blood.
Several
Lawrence and Exploitation
later.
Seek the old blood. Let us partake in communion and feast upon the old blood. Our thirst for blood satiates us, soothes our fear.
One sought to understand the Great Ones so as to be able to dominate them, and one sought to just fucking beat the shit out of everything and do horrible experiments until, I guess, they win somehow. We arrived to Yharnam in a citywide stalemate. The choir, Bergenworth, and the medical church have all hit a wall with their respective methodologies. It's not until the player themselves accepts that the dynamic between humans and this higher power is not one that can be quantified, medicalized, or controlled. Refusing to accept this, trying inanely to force the Great Ones into submission in any form, started at the massacre in the fishing hamlet with the violation of a mother. A primitive cult of worship had sprung up in the fishing hamlet after Kos washed up. She's a great one. This anarchic style of worship was outmoded and primitive to the Healing Church of Yharnam as much as the pagan practices in Pentiment Tassing were to the real church. The church saw Kos, this beached, helpless creature, as a golden opportunity. Finally, something that can't fight back. The same goes for the fishing hamlet itself. The church hunters came armed to the teeth, mowed down the entire hamlet, then captured survivors to perform brutal experiments on in the name of scientific progress. The massacre was not motivated by religious conflict, but a lust for power. It's scientifically driven, closer to the brutalities of the Enlightenment than the Crusades. In the Enlightenment, patriarchy remodeled itself. The same power structure remained, but roles were renamed. Magisters became the new priests. A revolving door of scientific theories dressed in religious language steered the zeitgeist like the Healing Church manipulates Yharnam from under ribbed vaults. The steady transition to secularity presented conflicts not only around the view of the world order as seen from the heavens, but also the perspective down in the dark gutters of the city itself. Now, we spoke about the daytime Victorian cityscape as a stage for the deepening of gender norms, but that only fully applied to the middle class and bourgeois. In poorer districts, and especially at night, gender was not as polite a force. People in history were freaky. Too freaky for YouTube, and this pervasive undercurrent of society's true freakiness was a threat to bourgeois standards of respectability, a set of freaky little eyes glowing in the dark. It is fitting that Bloodborne should be set in the no-man's land of gender that was the Victorian night. In the dark, the gendered geography of the city was not as easy to make out and enforce. The 1800s vampire was a manifestation of upper-class anxieties around the blurring of gendered boundaries after dark. The lines in the cobblestone that grew more diffuse with every hour that passed after women's curfew. While Bloodborne's themes of femininity are brought forward more in the latter half of the game, the vampires we see in the early game notably spawned into culture in part from anxieties around female sexual autonomy. Ladies of the evening and streetwalkers are both expressions that serve to connect the growing mobility of women to the decay of moral values. while the wee hours remained as physically threatening as the day for the prowling fallen women, as it were, the unconstrained mobility presented in darkness was equally threatening to the phantasm of gender in return. Gaggles of unaccompanied women in any time and place were potentially world-shattering for those concerned with keeping them in their place. We'll talk about the impact of women's ability to move about the place in general, but for now, let's get nocturnal.
What is it then? I'm off during hunts, and besides, this is no place for ladies.
In Bloodborne, the progression of the night of the hunt leads to the female Great Ones indeed shattering the world order. Lauren's fucking dead, Willem fucking in dispense, and Mikolash fucking...
Cause. Or some say
crazy. There is no one there to uphold principles of masculinity on an institutional level. Principles of rationality and dominance in the face of something entirely unbeatable and beyond human comprehension generated an inevitable friction that had to resolve somewhere. The schism in the medical church happened not due to differing faiths, but because of different approaches to the act of conquering what is, to them, only temporarily intangible until they get their grubby little science hands on it. Lawrence tries to dominate through violence, and Willem tries to dominate through knowledge. Mikolash is a silly boy. Each attempts to contort the world into patriarchal belief systems, while all of these factions use aesthetic symbols meant to instill a sense of infallible tradition and authority. If you asked anyone in them what their actual plan was, they would say something like, well, we put slugs in people's heads because the slugs are really old, so they must be smart. And maybe if we put them in your head, they talk to you and they'll tell us how to unfuck Yarnum and become omniscient. Or maybe we could try putting water in people's heads, because water is even older. You see what I'm saying? They're two methodologies, basically just trying shit out, but being an institution that prides itself on masculine characteristics of rationality, in strict conflict with the irrationality assigned to femininity, they will insist time and time again that they totally have it figured out, and all these other bozos aren't actually scientific, manly, smart men like us. The medical church, its offshoot, and the choir, and even the University of Bergenwurst have no interest in actually knowing the truth of the world as it is, because it's not what they want it to be. It doesn't reflect their values and assumptions. Here's where we get a bit broader. What is gender? Nowadays, the phrase gender as a construct is taken as a statement on the artificiality of gender expression. When repeated in isolation, it implies an indifference. The statement on its own is just an acknowledgement of gender that omits connecting it to anything uncomfortably political. Now, gender norms, be they expectations on self-expression or the demographic trends they perpetuate, shouldn't be set in stone. This is, of course, true. People should be allowed to present themselves however they want and to work within the fields that interest them and so on. So yes, gender and all its persuasions are made up. In form, it is a social construct. Yet there is a toothless ambiguity about the idea when the function of the construct is left out. You might as well assume that gender was invented to give people a framework of self-expression, out of which the patriarchy grew as an undesired secondary effect. The word patriarchy comes from ancient Greek. It's not a postmodern invention. It means rule of the father, referring to the structure of a household and the distinction between public and private life. It's about who gets to control resources, who gets to go where and do what, and why women don't get to do some of this stuff. Patriarchy is the ground which gender is built on. So, as gender has grown more complex, we see societal developments get woven into it. Whenever new positions of power emerged, they were defined as masculine by the dudes who held them. As shown, the cities became masculine because of pre-established associations with the feminine countryside and masculine urban environment. Through a masculine perspective, the process of city building is taming the wilderness as one tames a woman, then forging it into one's own domain, rendering whatever was there before secondary. So, women became secondary, their knowledge primitive and intuitive, so that supposed male rationality meant men were to guide society. I brought up the Enlightenment because the early stages of society's transition to secularity reflects the conflict in Yarnum. European societies have moved once from comparatively free-spirited pagan practices to the more prescriptive Christianity, and then again into a society where academia controlled the idea of reason and logic, and also information and books and stuff. Early academia, as a set of masculinized fields, then of course defined the world as a place where men belonged at the top. Binomial nomenclature, the system we get all those funny fake names for animals from, was originally created by one of history's most radioactively autistic men, Carl von Linné. He sought to name and categorize every living and not living thing he could get his own grubby little science hands on, which someone had to do, eventually. But with the nature of society at the time and patriarchy's tendency to denote everything that wasn't a white dude in degrees of primitiveness, he also invented race. That didn't go very well. It's here you see that a strive for knowledge is still beholden to a bit of bias. Despite humans having no provably nascent behavioral traits, human nature is still interpreted under the bright, white, masculine sun. So let's see about that moon. Blood from your vagine, the man descending to primitive werewolf, the sex and gendery vampire. Everything ladies, everything that belongs in the shadows. Whatever the moon gives us is borrowed from the sun, just like Eve was only a rib plucked from Adam. It's the second celestial body, like women are the second sex. The night follows the day. Masculinity is not an identity. Its only purpose is to define what is lesser than masculinity. Femininity is simply the shadows it casts. You can make an argument for the opposite, even from within the constrictions of binary gender. Why can't the sun be a she? It heals, it gives life, it nurtures. Despite the validity of that comparison, the value system of gender dictates that the sun's dominance cannot be assigned to women. Instead, women are the dependent object with no light of its own. The moon presence, or flora, is of a different, Bloodborne moon, one that casts its own light. Giving up at the end of the game is surrendering to Guin and returning to a world lit by the sun. In a traditional narrative, this would be the end goal, finding our way out of the shadows, putting Yharnam back under the sun, and returning to the world where the moon is secondary. Western culture has long associated masculinity and goodness with light. So ending the night is a fitting end for Guin, as he himself is an extension of Lawrence, left to watch over the hunter's dream until the boss man returns. Lawrence is of course long fucking dead, he's never coming back, so Guin simply sits there, getting wheeled around by the doll he created to be a sex doll version of a woman he once knew with her free will and capacity for unspeakable violence removed. Let's also touch briefly on the Inherit the Dream ending, where you defy Guin only to take his place as Warden of the Dream. This ending only serves to perpetuate the cycle. Nothing new comes of it. Masculinity spirals into further violence and the embarrassment it's made for itself, and the world stays a dystopia. There's the Rast Game Dungeon episode of All Things, where he says, "We don't get enough utopias in games." There's something to that, isn't there? Why should stories only explore the obstructions to our freedom from the shitty end of the spectrum? He says that dystopias usually make for more interesting settings, but how much of that is innately true and how much is from circumstance? I'd agree that we generally find them more relatable, as we don't live in a utopia, but at the same time, I think there's equal ground to explore humanity from the utopian perspective. It takes more imagination to create a world without relying on frustration. It takes effort to imagine people as inherently good. There can still be conflict, even if that conflict is not the starting point. Yharnam is, by all means, a shithole, yet the peak of evolution had been achieved before it turned to one. It's a piece disrupted by the construct of gender. Oedon is the single great one referred to with masculine pronouns, but is he any different from any other great one in its final, formless state of ascendance? Whether he or she, that state is as ancient and primitive as it is futuristic and sophisticated. The distinction of femininity as a lesser primitive appendage to the superior masculine is not on the mind of an omniscient creature. So while Bloodborne is dystopian at a ground level, its plot takes place under a moon that shines independently. One that gives life, heals, and nurtures the flowers in the dream, or roam us back and in the lumen flower gardens where they're designed to explicitly resemble sunflowers. So down at that ground level, are the sun and the moon so meaningfully different once the gendered characteristics we've projected onto them are removed? The book I quoted at the beginning of this video is about a planet where they just didn't happen to invent gender. And lo and behold, that world is at peace until humanity brings it there. There is no womanhood to be made secondary, so instead the entire native species is defined as lesser to the men who colonize the planet, revealing that gender at its core is not a matter of identity, but a framework for subjugation. We don't say gender is a construct simply because it's artificial, but because it's the construct that upholds patriarchy. I want to be a person before I'm a woman. Not as in I want to be non-binary or I want to be a man, but that I want to stop being something that isn't a man. This is why we collect third chords, ladies. While you can build a city on the soil, categorize everything from plant to person, or shut women up or kill them, you can't actually shut the great ones up or ever truly kill them. And the great ones are women. Now, interpretations of that metaphor can go one of two ways. You can look at it as an actual allegory for the subjugation of women and a message that it can't go on forever. Or you can say women have magical girl power because of our wombs. I would like to argue for the former, since the trope of the divine feminine, while often taken as empowering now, is born from a deeply harmful expression of bioessentialism. While empowering on the surface by its implication that uniquely feminine traits coming from the body itself give us unique powers, the chosen traits hail from a restrictive set of stereotypes around women. A specifically female divinity in this sense is not a spontaneously generated piece of ideology. The core idea we can trace our modern conception of divine femininity to is the one that purports women's brains are controlled by their wombs, and their wombs are controlled by a masculine god, reinforcing the idea of women as submissive by nature and to the divine in nature. The actions of saints and witches alike are all imagined as acts of subservience, so women submit to nature and nature submits to men, or is at least supposed to in the end. Bloodborne rejects this notion by showing men like Willem and Lawrence get rejected by the Great Ones. The bridge between women and the Great Ones via motherhood is an oppressive milieu not because of the Great Ones themselves, but because of the traditions of worship from Thumru to Yharnam that position women as catalysts in their role as surrogate mothers. Queen Yharnam's whole life was about her surrogacy. There was nothing else for her, because she had been elevated to this object of worship without agency. There's a twisting of the natural, or in this case supernatural, function of childbirth into the great ascetic act that women's entire lives must center around, even if a lack of resources to support childbirth would mean their death. In Bloodborne's world, this is in service to attaining power, to wrestling nature into control. The pointlessness of trying to resist natural cycles in order to uphold patriarchal structures is a theme present in From's catalog, stretching from Demon Souls to Elden Ring. The Old One is imprisoned in the Nexus. Guin tries to stop the fading of the flame, and Radon desperately holds back the falling stars, but none of those games integrate gender into that conflict as tangibly as Bloodborne. There's an understated dynamic of gender present in each, which varies in resonance, but they never say it with their fucking chests like Bloodborne. The Maiden in Black is the Warden of the Old One. The fading of the flame represents a breakdown of gender binaries, and Rani, with her moon, capitalized on Radon's failure to resist this femininely coded celestial force. But at the character level, women still have to submit to nature while men embody the norm as conquerors of it. Arena of Karim in Dark Souls 3 is broken in body and spirit and cared for by the hyper-masculine Aegon of Karim. The various Firekeepers are similarly broken. Their portrayal as ascetic martyrs and constant suffering is portrayed as a natural expression of the relationship between women and nature. Their victimization is used for dramatic flair to give the world edge, an all too common trope. Bloodborne, however, is not in the business of torture porn in service to fiction. It stands with Pentiment as a critique of the trope and the attitudes that gave rise to it. The game centers on a female power greater than the patriarchy. Because of the scale of that power, female liberation is inevitable. The story does not resolve into a scenario which tacitly asserts that men have a superior capacity for rational thought. The medical church deals in blood, as has Yharnam since it was known as Thumru. It's a known tradition. Lawrence being in possession of blood from the Thumerian labyrinth was what got him accepted in Yharnam in the first place, despite the xenophobia in Yharnamite society.
Are you that outsider? Well, sorry, but I don't want anything to do with you. Trot along, will ya?
That's what let him set up the church itself. What's not traditional, however, is the commodification of blood in the female body. Now let's not beat around the bush. The blood is icky period blood from icky girls. Notions of female purity are questioned in the narrative. The lines in the sand between fallen and pure women that keep each fixed precariously in their place in society are blurred. So Yharnamites are Thumerians. They evolved over time to look less like gamers and more like humans, and out of that grew a distinction between pure Thumerian blood, beast blood, pale blood, obtuse blood, rubber goose, guava juice, giant snake, chocolate shake blood, of which Thumerian blood was supposedly the purest. Now Thumerians are ding-dongs, basically a slave race blindly worshipping the Great Ones. We see chained church giants and lantern dudes on the surface in Cathedral Ward. In the labyrinth underneath the city and in Canehurst, we see them at different physical and cultural stages of evolution. We know that blood communion and Great One surrogacy were purely spiritual practices for who knows how many hundreds or thousands of years before the arrival of Lawrence and the medical church's rise to prominence. It's at that point, when studying and trading in blood became the primary mode of interaction, that we started to see designations of purity in women and their blood become significant. Women's bodies were now commodified to a much greater extent.
Would you even take a whore's blood? Oh, good. Come close, dear.
Ariana is a prostitute of Thumerian descent, at once the lowest of the low and the highest of the divine.
Beware the Lady of the Night. I can see it in her eyes. She deeply resents the young saint. She hears people whisper. She knows what people think of her. Yes. She despises the saint for having what she doesn't. Bloody wench, they should have moved her on ages ago.
She's looked down upon, but has extra magical blood, which the player has to accept in order to become a slimy snail goddess. Accepting Ariana's period blood is accepting that she is not filthy or desouled because of her work or simply having a body that menstruates. Whatever impurity is projected onto her by society is artificial, irrelevant to the material truth of Bloodborne's world. But Adela, the nun, stood across from her in the church where we find each, is disgusted with her owing to the beliefs she's adopted from the patriarchal medical church. She gets more mad the more of Ariana's blood you consume until her internalized misogyny makes her snap and fucking kill Ariana, unless you do anything about it. Due to what she's been taught to value about herself as a nun, she simply can't reconcile with the fact that Ariana is not beneath her because of her impurity. From the chronological start of the narrative in the fishing helmet up to and beyond, this incongruence between the dogma of the patriarchy and the actual nature of human beings is shown to be one that will inevitably conclude in femicide if it's allowed to go on. Yet as its artifice is revealed, when we start to understand the mechanics of our oppression, we start to see ways out of it. Without a myth to anchor the gendered hierarchy, we start to drift off into dreams. These dreams, be they a post-patriarchal frame of mind or a literal game space, are an underutilized region of thought in art, despite the fact we find ourselves in them for a good deal of our real lives. Most feminist media is unconcerned with imagining liberation as Emily Bronte did in The Old Stoic, we'll get to that later, instead focusing on the relative minutiae within patriarchal oppression. Bloodborne, gloomy as it is, imagines something greater through the Great Ones. While a world beyond the patriarchy can seem like something relegated to dreams, there's a microcosm of it in the waking world of Bloodborne. The closest thing to a hub we have in Bloodborne's overworld is the chapel of our formless yet friend-shaped Oedon. Despite possibly housing an actual Great One, that being Oedon, it's insignificant culturally within Yharnam. A forgotten place, but still one that everyone seems to know about. It's a sanctuary from the outside world and maintained by the unnamed chapel dweller, an unalloyed little guy if there ever was one. When discussing the Victorian domestic environment, we talked about the home as a sanctuary from the public sphere and the seat of moral and cultural stability that was to be maintained by a woman, but in Oedon Chapel, it's the same but different. Were the Oedon Chapel a traditional domestic sphere, then the chapel dweller would be the default master of it, but he instead takes the role of a woman within the home, instead a caring, compassionate host despite being coded as a man. The inversion of gender norms continues with the second of the three male occupants.
Outsiders will always be outsiders.
The narrow-minded man is someone guided by emotion, acting irrationally, seen in how he will do the opposite or whatever the player tells him, and only tells lies. His failings are ones he would typically blame the womb for. The only masculine man is the suspicious beggar who will slaughter everyone in the chapel if you send him there, but he is, crucially, made capable of this violence because of period blood, and gets his way through deception instead of respect. That wording right there, made capable, is emblematic of how Bloodborne builds its world. The suspicious beggar is not dominant by default because he's the manliest man in Oedon Chapel. He's a scheming, dishonest agent of the medical church. As evidenced by placement of the beast blood pellets he doles out by mission of the medical church, he is empowered by an institution, not by testosterone alone. In keeping with theme, male violence is not natural but made possible through coordinated efforts. The ultimate justification for patriarchy that always reveals itself if you just keep asking questions is that it's simply natural. Men are strong and intelligent, women are weak and sensitive. The womb itself is to blame, quite literally. The name for the diagnosis that used to put outspoken women in mental asylums, hysteria, is derived from the Greek word for womb. When a woman became hysterical, it was because the womb had dislodged itself and was running wild inside her body. As such, the woman was not in control of her womanhood. Unfeminine behavior like aggression or promiscuity was instinctively blamed on a faulty womanhood in some shape or form. I say some shape or form because this echoes in modern medical practice. Take any symptom to a doctor and within the first 5 minutes they will ask if you're pregnant or ask about your menses, the latter meaning menstruation, like the school of menses. The view of women as naturally sensitive before intelligent is often reinforced with a smile through connecting biological womanhood to myths of divine femininity. It's in hysteria where the concept has its roots. Women's intuitive, irrational knowledge comes not from the small little woman brain, but from a different magic place that little brain has a subservient bond to through whatever set of symbols of femininity happen to be in style. One that never goes out of style is the female body itself, which is why Bloodborne grounds its critique there. This is a story about a world moving beyond a failing patriarchy. This wouldn't have been the case if it weren't for Bloodborne's rejection of traditional narrative structure. None of the women involved are simply stand-ins for a male-centered hero narrative. There is no ghost of masculinity hanging over this story. Women don't have to put the baggage of their womanhood aside to be active within the narrative. The issue with an overly careful approach to feminism is that you often wind up meeting the patriarchy at what looks like halfway, but is in truth the glass ceiling. Women can be lifted up to the skies above so long as they remain a complement to masculinity that doesn't supersede it. We can be the ones to hang the moon itself as long as the men rule the cosmos. But in Bloodborne, women do. I wouldn't call games escapist in the way they typically are, that being as toys with screens attached that don't say anything unless they yell it at the player. And Bloodborne is dark and sad and bloody and full of gender anxiety, but it's still somehow comforting to me to exist in a game world with these thematic undercurrents, where inequality between the sexes exists, but the game as a whole still assures me that it's not the true way of things. Bloodborne takes the shape of a game catering to men and men only, but speaks privately and reassuringly to women as human beings. And logically, wet little slugs on the ground next to a burning building in the dream of an eldritch monstrosity, as is our true nature. Let me be slug. I am cold. Pick me up. Hello. At what point do we go from slaughtering prey to slaying nightmares? It's never directly stated who the Great Ones are nightmares to, but for me, it's defo the medical church. Consider how progress is coded in Dark Souls 1. In terms of the Soulsborne formula, Lawrence is the equivalent of Guin. In a first playthrough, when the player assumes their pilgrimage to Lordran is part of a righteous, world-saving prophecy, the victory achieved screen is part of Gwyn's deception. Beating Sif is a victory to Guin, but not to us. We're crying. In Bloodborne, we ostensibly side with the Great Ones, despite the fact that we fucking kill all of them. They're mothers who can't be tamed or even understood, so killing them is to the medical church a righteous slaughter. We're supposedly ridding the world of a terrible nightmare. A lot of people take UI elements, names, and item descriptions as absolute truths in the Soulsborne games, so often that's not the case. As an example, what's referred to as the eyes dropped by the basilisk enemies in Dark Souls aren't their actual eyes. Their real eyes are situated below whatever these eyes of death are. They're named because of how they would appear to someone in-universe. The same goes for the actual names of the Great Ones. The Moon Presence appears along with the moon, so it's the Moon Presence.
O Flora of the moon, of the dream.
Ebrietas resembles Ebrietas butterfly, so she's Ebrietas. Rome got her name from Roma, the woman she was before ascending. They changed it in localization because they figured it wasn't such a great idea to have a boss be named identically to an ethnic minority, but I digress. She's called Vacuous because the Bergenworth scholars thought she was dumb and didn't ascend properly. A lot of Bloodborne is lost in verbal and cultural translation, as most of the plot's underlying ideas stem largely from Shinto and Buddhism despite the Christian set dressing. Menstrual blood as a motif is not only a comment on Western patriarchy, but also its connection to impurity, or kegare, within Shinto. The common denominator being the associated hostility and disgust toward women's bodies, a conflict inherent to patriarchy. The incompatibility between the masculinist Western ideology around the intersection of science and divinity comes from a set of fundamental incongruences, once highlighted by FromSoft's narrative and gameplay design. They're all games about beating big bosses, but there's never an impartial declaration of dominance or mastery from the game. Barring exploits, you're always on the back foot up until the very end of the games, and even then the actual resolutions of their plots give you, to borrow YouTube video title parlance, nothing. This is most strongly emphasized when defeating Murgo's Sweat Nurse. There's not only the abrupt silence of the boss theme cutting out, but an almost fourth wall breaking span of time between the kill and the nightmare slain text appearing. In that silence, there's only a single sound playing. An infant is dead. Did I win? We don't beat the healing church and take its place. We simply accept that what's done is done. The fishing hamlet and collapse of Thumur, Yarnum, Oedon, U were the logical endpoints of its modus operandi. The desired outcome of mastering everything between heaven, earth, and beyond is something that never came for them. In the end, Lawrence, in a last-ditch effort to ascend, let go of any scientific pretense he might have clung on to and entered into a pact of submission to the moon presence. He did a little ritual thingy, and Flora dreamed up the hunter's dream based on the ancient, primitive hunter's workshop where Lawrence performed the ritual. Going by the state of the great tree, we can see that the workshop is, like Oedon Chapel, a stagnant, forgotten place, with a lone, dilapidated house illuminated only by the moon and absolutely buried in flowers that represents the distinction of the rural feminine as antiquated and the urban masculine as the future. A product of strong, brawny men hacking up stone and leveling forests for material so that intelligent men could deem how best to assemble it according to rational principles of geometry, and then so that the most rational thinking men could then rule over it unobstructed by inferior, irrational feminine emotion, while their spiritually submissive predecessors in Thumur remain quite literally underfoot. The hunter's workshop is left as a feminine relic far below the high strata of the cathedral ward. Yet that place, dreamed up by Flora herself, still towers just above the fog in the shadow of the great cathedral, from within which Flora empowers one to move freely throughout the Victorian cityscape like the women at the time in real life never could, because you can just teleport everywhere. That everywhere including the hunter's nightmare, where all of the church's emotional undercurrents are collected and made manifest in a realm of pure anxious intuition. Lawrence, burning from within, unable to stop the player from discovering the most shameful secret of the church in the fishing hamlet, the untamed frontier, what would be considered nothing but ripe for conquering by men, is in Bloodborne, the nightmare frontier, or, put more succinctly, a catastrophe of masculinity. Patriarchy does not have a conclusion, but it has an end. Okay, well that doesn't explain anything.